to see you here.
Happy Sabbath, guys.
Good morning and happy Sabbath, everyone.
Hey, happy Sabbath.
I'm not Jerry Richmond, they're both doing as well. Sketchy today. That's okay.
He taught last week.
Yeah. And initially online it had last week's information. It was a mix, but he's been corrected here. I'm not complaining because I don't have to do it. And that's a hard job. I've done it in other churches, and no matter how many times you tell people, give me the information by Wednesday, there's always the one person that sends it to you Friday afternoon. Oh, tomorrow's Sabbath. It was going to be Sabbath for the last 7 days, but just like last week and the week before and the week before. So it's a thankless job, so I appreciate you have to do it on. It's a hard job, a thankless job. Let's start with a little prayer here. Father God, we come to you this Sunday Sabbath morning. We thank you for the day you've given us here for the Sabbath day. We pray that you'll be with us throughout the day here for the Sabbath school, that we'd have open minds and hearts. We pray over the discussion we could have. We would all grow and learn from it. We pray for the service following and the fellowship meal after that as well. We just thank you for everyone that's here today. Pray for those who want to be here but for whatever reason can't be. We just lift those things up to you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Is that me? I think this cable might be. You're going to try not to touch or jiggle the cable here, so. Did everybody have a good week? Really great to see Stan recovered. Everyone else did today, this morning. We always start with not that many people, but by the end of the service, we always have plenty. Sometimes I save or repeat things for them, but today we have plenty, so we're not going to do that. So the memory text for this week was Daniel 7:14. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. So as we look through history, that's the story of history, right? Is one kingdom after another rise up and either self-destruct or taken over by somebody else. And so it's kind of like sports teams. One's dominant and then they're not. So that's this quarter is illusions, symbols, images and symbols. It was written by Sean Boostra. I don't know how many of you watch his online. He has some really good things. He has a thing called Authentic where he just sits and has some pretty deep conversations. But the title is a little misleading. I thought, oh, it's going to be all about symbols or whatever. But it's really the subtitle. It's how understanding Bible prophecy is really what we're talking about here. So out of the lesson, we start with talking about the political history of the world, basically. One of the key issues in both Daniel and Revelation is the succession of human attempts to control a planet that rightfully belongs to God. That's kind of where we're going with this. But we know that that's never worked, right? There's never been a perfect government. There's been some that are good, some that are benevolent in one way or another. So I'm sure we've all heard the saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So as long as human government is run by humans, you can be a good person, but eventually we know the arc, the trajectory that it always takes. So it's never worked, and it's often fallen terribly short of being ideal. And that's basically much of history of humanity is nothing but accounts of the tragedy that happens from those things. So we know in the Garden of Eden, God made it was perfection, right? That was the way things were supposed to be. There wasn't death. There was no hostility. Even animals didn't kill each other. But from the very beginning, humans, it's just our nature, our fallen nature, is we want to be in control. And that's true in a big picture, and it's true even think in a household, or much of the conflict is, oh, I want to do this and you want to do that, and which one of us, right? So we're not just talking on a macro system, but we're talking micro system as well. The human nature is a problem. So as I was studying this, I found some really neat parallels, though, between God's perfect plan and I'm going to use the word counterfeit plan of ours. That's probably not the best word to use, but you'll see where I'm going with this. In the Garden of Eden, God, he said 10 times, as God said. Remember those? God said, and there was. God said. But we see in the garden, then the counterfeit, right? The serpent comes and the serpent said, to Eve. So there's a counterfeit there. The construction of the phrase is troubling, and this was really interesting as I was studying into the Hebrew part of it. The construction of the phrase is troubling, for the subject of the verb he said is not indicated. If we jump down to add confusion, the verb is even preceded in the Hebrew by the name Elohim. So it actually says God. That's rendered as God. El is God. Giving the impression that God is speaking. The Hebrew text has the following sequence of words. God, or he, said to the woman, and so it's almost like the serpent has already tried to replace God. Right there in the first, we're not even 2 pages in, and already we see usurping and the counterfeit. And then Eve takes that same counterfeit language. So remember, God, he separated the sky, and he saw it was good. He made the plants, and he saw it was good. The phrase in here, the woman, Eve, saw it was good with the apple. So it's, again, from the very beginning, we're seeing this trying to duplicate God's perfection with our desires. She took of the fruit and gave to her husband with her, which is the same language God gave to Eve. God took the man, and God took one of his ribs. So from the very beginning, we're trying to be the creator ourselves, right? We're trying to create our own destiny. We're trying to create our own concept of good and bad, right? We decide what's good, what's bad, or do we want to anyway. It ignores the fact that there is a truer reality. I don't care what you think is good. If God doesn't think it's good, it's not good, right?
Amen.
You can call it, what was the saying, you put lipstick on a pig, it's not a pig, so we can call it something else, but no, it's not a pig, so. I can go on with it, there's quite a few more of those, but when we get to the Babel, which is literally means gate of God. El, when you see El in Hebrew scripture, and it's also interesting also when you look at Mesopotamian literature and all, they called their gods with a lower e, because they had many of them. It was El something, that was God of lightning or God of whatever. So when you see that, look at the root there. So again, there's those echoes because let me see where maybe just already this intention is indicated in the table of nations, which we're going to get to, is in which Nimrod's foundation of the kingdom of Babel is introduced with the technical word Risha, or beginning, which echoes the divine creation account. Nimrod, whose name means we shall rebel, is presented as the creator of Babel, just as God is the creator of the heavens and earth. And you should know that Nimrod is most likely his nickname's kind of the wrong thing, but like his title almost. So scholars believe he had a different name, in part because in other historical records we don't see the name of Nimrod. But, and so Sean Booster he's actually working on a documentary about it, about Nimrod and this table of nations. It's a really important study here. So in the story of the Tower of Babel, we observe that same usurpation. You have the word of God, Wayomer Elohim, God said, has been replaced by the builder's word, Wayomoro, they said. The divine fulfillment of God's creation, when he says, and there was, is replaced by human achievement, and it was. You also see the same word being used when God is creating. He says, let us make man in our image or whatever. And in the story of Babel, they say the same thing. Let us make a tower to the gate of heaven. Again, trying to do it our way and recreate. So the table of nations, which is Genesis, in the book they say Genesis 1 through 12. It really goes much further than that, because if you stop at 12, you've only dealt with two of the descendants of Noah. Eden was created as the ideal home for the human race, and once sin entered, God had no choice but to separate humanity from the garden and the tree of life. Jump down, but this is all in the book. Hopefully you've read this. Others, however, worked on man-made solutions to our newfound problems. We see the birth of city-states and an attempt to create an easier life, and perhaps to try to recapture what was lost in Eden. Right? So in Eden, there was plenty of food, there was trees, there was whatever. We didn't have to actually create farms. We didn't have to. There was community, not just between the humans, but community with God in person. Remember that? So then we try to create cities, and that's still a thing going on, right? If you look at urban planning and stuff, it's like a big thing. Well, what do we do so people can connect? How do we design a city so that people can connect? In developments and all. Well, what can we do? Can we we should be able to walk out and walk through the lush beauty of a garden and be able to pick a fruit and eat and things. So in the Table of Nations is basically the story of after the flood. Remember, Noah had 3 sons, and we're going to kind of go through those. Again, we're only going to actually cover Ham and Japheth, but not Shem because they end at 12, but I'll cover that just real briefly. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. And then it breaks it down into who the different sons were. And then there's the story of the Hamites. And I heard this the other day. So the Hamites, if you look at who those become, Cush, Egypt, the Canaanites, there's a lot of the names here that become enemies with God's people ultimately. So one of the ways you can remember that Ham was the bad one, because remember Ham was the one who initiated humiliating his father Noah when he was drunk. We know that story. No? So you can remember Ham is bad, right? Yeah. Because what does God tell us about pigs? All right. So now you know which family branch, right? You'll never forget that. Okay. So then it's going through all these families, and then there's kind of this weird diversion. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on earth. He was a mighty hunter before God. And you can see that he went on to build Nineveh. So this is where things get interesting. I said that Nimrod probably isn't his actually given name. And it's confusing because here it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That makes it sound like he's a hero, right? In the Septuagint, it's actually rendered, he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. And this is just a little aside here, but so the Septuagint is it's based on 72 scholars that Ptolemy of Egypt commissioned about in the third century BC. Have we ever seen that in the Christian scriptures where there's diversion of whatever against believers, and a secular ruler says, "Hey, I can't have that. You guys got to figure this out." And he appointed 72 Jewish scholars to create the Septuagint, which it's interesting now, even actually at the time, it was about 300 years old at the time of Jesus. And there was already controversy among Jewish people saying, "No, you guys rendered those wrong," because they were trying to make an Egyptian pharaoh. They had to put him in a certain light because he was commissioned it and paid for it, right? Kind of like there's some people say King James, and I don't have those verses in front of me, but they promote basically having a king because who commissioned it? King James, right? So you're not going to highlight scripture or emphasize words that say we're not to have a king because you'll probably lose your head. So that's important to remember.
I was just curious as to whether this Nineveh is the same Nineveh that Jonah was sent to. Do you know?
It is, according to...
So that city lasted for quite a while.
Quite a while.
Yeah.
And again, it's from that family of Ham. And we know they were... Now, they did turn, remember? But we know they were exceedingly wicked, and that's why Jonah didn't even want to go. It's like, it wasn't that he didn't want to go on a boat ride to Nineveh. It was, it's like go on a cruise across the Mediterranean. It's not bad. No, it was they were are exceedingly wicked. He's like, I don't want anything to do with those filthy, disgusting people. Which we have to admit, if we're honest with ourselves, we probably have that feeling, right? With someone, in some way. We just, I don't want anything to do with that. And maybe like Jonah, maybe that's the person you need to go to, because they really don't face a dramatic turnaround. Yeah, Nineveh was actually the capital of the Assyrian Empire at that time. And that's why it was called the great city. So I was looking at some Jewish things and reading on this. In Genesis 10:8, and Cush began Nimrod. He began to be a mighty man on earth, is how some of the renderings are. And that could be rendered as giant, or as a hero, probably a local hero. But it doesn't mean, again, that he was a man of God. We can think of numerous leaders. I mean, you can think of, I hate to even bring up, you can think of Hitler. He was a great leader for his people, right? I mean, they crowded around him, he knew how to get things done and whatever. Mussolini, they said that the trains never ran late in Italy under Mussolini because he was that. But so that doesn't necessarily make you a man of God. There's some of the rabbis looking back at this. They talk about Jubal and Tubal Cain, the fathers of all herders and musicians, and there's other ones like that. So they're thinking perhaps when it says he was a mighty hunter, that it actually means that he was like the, I don't want to say the creator of hunting, but he was like the founder. I'm trying to think of a personality or whatever, but so he, just like they say, like Tubal Cain is the father of musicians. Well, I'm sure people were creating his music, whatever, but we can think of Nimrod as that same way. So ultimately, it's that Nimrod was a hunter king, and the first king that we know of the Assyrian Empire through the biblical records. So this is where it gets interesting. A lot of people have heard of the epic of Gilgamesh. It was an Assyrian archaeologist digging the historic Nineveh. And it's the first written extra-biblical reference to the worldwide flood outside of the Bible. So we do have, and it goes through, and there was one man, say, who had sons who populated the earth. Very similar, right? So this is where we get into a little bit of Christian apologetics here. So people are going to tell you, well, this was written, and it's true, this was written onto a clay tablet before any of the Hebrew texts were physically written. So the question is, does that make the Christian story a myth that's copied from somebody else's myth? Because this one actually does predate. There's physical proof that this predates the writing. So what would you say when someone says that to you as a Christian? Well, your Noah is the same as Gilgamesh, and they'll have a comparison for other biblical characters. Does anyone have an answer for that? Say it again.
What if I said it's kind of true? It went through a flood.
Exactly.
It went through a flood.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's still there, and it was like more like truth.
Right. How many witnesses do you need to something happen? Right? Don't we say 2 or more witnesses? So is this debunking and saying Christianity is a myth? Or is it saying, no, there's other witnesses? There's witnesses, in Mayan, you don't need to say the word hieroglyphics, but there's records of Mayan people talking about there was a worldwide flood. Does that make Christianity false? Or does it prove it? That on the opposite side of the world, the literal opposite side of the world, people are saying, somewhere in our history, we have the story, our ancestors told us there was a worldwide flood. Right? It actually strengthens Christianity, not debunks it. This is told from the Babylonian viewpoint. But that's to be expected, right? You have, just like in world history, if you talk to someone in Japan about World War II, they're going to have you a pretty different story than someone from here. So they believe that Gilgamesh was the first king of Uruk, which is Iraq, in modern times. And we believe that Gilgamesh is Nimrod. And I say, Sean Booster is actually working on a documentary showing all that evidence also. If you're not on, he's not Voice of Prophecy. I gave him all mixed up. It is written. He's okay. And also for Sabbath school, it's really good. We have an abundance of Sabbath school. You can go online and check out the Hope Sabbath School, and that's a kind of a real discussion one. It is written every quarter, actually has Sabbath school with the author, so it's worth checking. And then, well, of course, F3 again has one, this kind of panel. I'm trying to think who else, but use those resources because it's really amazing. I watched the Sean Booster one, and he was excited to talk. In the whole lesson for this week, he didn't get past Monday. Because he was so excited telling us about Gilgamesh and all that. So you get a really different perspective. It just becomes much, much deeper. So again, this is called the Deluge Tablet of Gilgamesh, and it's written in Akkadian, which when we look at the list of Table of Nations, Acadia was one of those. So again, there's these tiebacks, and they don't. In the Bible, it talks about Acadia and Akkadian. Gilgamesh is written in all languages, Akkadian. So again, this just it should strengthen your belief. Anyway. And again, like I say, Sean is working on a thing to actually prove all this. Well, that's kind of Nimrod is kind of a break from the Table of Nations, because it's going through and it tells the story of Nimrod. The compilers of the Table of Nations included Nimrod as one of the topological 70 descendants of Noah. Later Jewish tradition, noting the fact that Shinar appears in both relation to Nimrod and the Tower of Babel story, makes Nimrod the builder of the tower and understands him as the archetypical evil king, so not a hero. Maybe be a hero to his people, but he is not a man of God. His wickedness was understood to inherit in his very name, derived from the verb to rebel. So instead of a great hunter before Yahweh, he becomes the ultimate rebel before God. So like I said, that Nimrod passage kind of interrupts the story here. But you can see, as we're talking, Tarshish, we're not positive that it was Spain, the Portugal area, but from other descriptions, that's probably where it was. We know it was somewhere on that side of the Mediterranean. But it interrupts the genealogy, and so we don't ever get to Ham, is in Ham, so we don't get to Shem, and we'll get to that in a second. But so you can see, it kind of shows you the structure of where the different people went. And it's interesting, we'll go to this too. So we never got to Shem, and I'm not going to go through them all, other than to point out. So list, and you'll see Eber. And the name Eber is actually a word formed from the already existing ethnic designation Hebrew or Hebrew. So in effect, Eber is Mr. Hebrew, the eponymous ancestor of the Hebrews. As such, he's the ancestor of Abraham and all the subsequent Israelites. So that's just important to know which family then all these came out of. And we know in that list there is one of the others then is Az, a descendant of Aaron, is mentioned as the home of Job, which the pastor is going to be speaking on today. I thought that was an interesting clarification. Scholars have debated whether Uz is located in Edom in North Arabia or Syria. Most evidence supports between North Arabia. In Genesis 36:28, Uz is listed among the descendants of Esau, or Edom. Remember the Edomites? It turned out, as you look through that genealogy, you'll find that Isaac and there's several others, as you go through, are actually part of that family. So you get the picture of the familial connection. So Genesis 10 ends with verse 32. These are the groupings of Noah's descendants according to their origins, by their nations, and from these the nations branched out over the earth after the flood. So you're seeing how humanity is all from one single extended family. And with 23andMe and all and the genealogy, do you know what science is finding? That we have a common ancestor. Everybody around the world, we can track down in the genes to one ancestor. Isn't that, I mean, pretty amazing, right? God told us that before any of us even knew what a gene was. So, like Tom spent a lot of time here, we're coming to Monday. In the 10th chapter of Genesis, we see the birth of various nations, and nations is Goyim, which you'll sometimes hear Jewish people using that as a term of, we'll say, disrespect towards anybody not Jewish by ethnicity. They refer to us as Goyim. But you saw how it was all divided up. So the question is going to come up, and we're going to read Genesis 12:1 through 4 here. But the question is going to be, as we're reading this, to be thinking, why did God call Abram, or later Abraham, out of his country of origin? So, does anyone want to read, or should I just read it? I'll read it. Genesis 12:1 through 4. The Lord said to Abram, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So that's pretty late in life to start a new adventure, right? To totally move away. A lot of us that late in life do move, but we tend to, like Vern, he stays in the area, but he's moved around, 5 times now? Something like that. But he's not moving across country and starting over, or moving to a new country that he's never been to.
And he's not in a railroad car either.
This is true. For those that don't know, Jen and I live half the year in a caboose. We're actually leaving. We're here this Sabbath, the next Sabbath, and then we're off. So glad to be able to be up there.
When I was little, my family lived in Boston.
like here. We drive flying in when we fly to visit our family in the past from the airport and be like, as you're flying in and it's like, yeah, this whole state is a golf course. It's green. I'm used to, there's a few parks there, even in Phoenix, there's only a few little blocks of green. There it's like green. But we're blessed to be here. God intended to use Abraham to establish a nation that would stand in contrast to human kingdoms. They were not to have a king other than God himself. The people were shown what happened. The human race returned to their Creator. Israel was established to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That's what Genesis 12:3 says. God poured out upon them light and privileges that had not been seen in the world since perhaps before the flood. The story goes on and him taking his family and all. So we go back to that question. Why do you think God called him out? Could God have blessed him and he would have the progeny where he was at? Does anyone have any? Some people mention that it could have been a possible conflict with Nimrod, which is interesting.
Well, I believe that God put Abraham's nation in Canaan for a purpose, because it was at the crossroads of wherever you were going, you had to go through Canaan. And if he had raised them up back in Haran, or even before that, in Ur, they would have been isolated.
Right. Yeah, that's a good reason. Any other reason? So, I think a point to go along with yours is God always has a purpose that we may not understand or define. Sometimes we can see, well, okay, I'll do it because God says, and this is nice. But like you're saying, a greater purpose is, that was the crossroads of the world. Right? So, it probably would have been really hard, too, for him to stay subject to another nation, to become a true monotheist in a polytheistic nation. It's enough conflict already just with other things going on. Can you imagine if everyone else is worshiping multiple gods and God's for any and everything, and you're saying, no, there's just one true God? You're probably going to run out of. And the point at this stage of Abraham's life wasn't necessarily to be that witness. It was to build the nation that would be the witness. So for that to happen, perhaps there was just too much conflict that it couldn't happen. We're going to be asked to read Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 9. I'll glance over that in a minute. But the question you're going to be looking at is, what was the Lord telling the children of Abraham, the nation that had become a fulfillment of the promise of God made to Abraham? And this is where we go into, so it's not just a single person. It's not just Abraham bearing witness to his community. But the point is that it becomes a nation that's cooperating with God. That, remember, it's the light on the hill, that all the other nations can say, yeah, we have this problem and that problem, whatever, but look at how Israel works. Just a little aside here, it's interesting some of the parallels. The Hebrews have their gods near to them the way the Lord our God is near to us whenever we pray to Him. And what other nation is so great as to have righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? So I want to touch on that, the body of laws. When you hear people talking about crime and retribution stuff, you'll hear people say, well, an eye for an eye. So, and I have to be careful how I say this, but even today we see, especially in the Middle East, there's just this anger and vengeance, right? We'll think of, I'm not getting political on this, but I'm just saying, if God told the Hebrews, and by extension all of us, you shall not have retribution more than an eye for an eye. You see, that was actually Hebrew rabbis and scholars have always pointed it out. That's not a commandment. It's not a commandment. If you slug me, I have to slug you back. In fact, Jesus tells us a different commandment, right? It was actually a moderation. It was saying, no, in my country, the way I want my people to act, you don't do anything more than do what's done to you. It was a limit. That was an amazing limit to the other countries at that time, because there was no such thing as eye for eye. It was, you do something, and I'm going to kill you. And I hate to say it, and I'm not getting political, but I'm just being real. October 7th, 1,200 people killed. How many thousands have been killed? Women and children. It's like 30, 40,000. If they had kept an eye for an eye, the Middle East would look very different. Right? So, again, I'm not trying to be political, but it's just the reality. Let me go back. What was the question? What was the Lord telling the children of Abraham, the nation that had become a fulfillment of the promise of God made to Abraham? So, does anybody have any thoughts on that?
It took me most of my life to realize an eye for an eye is so good to turn around and walk away and be a better man. Because people get hurt, things happen, other people get involved. It's just best just to go on
Right.
and do your thing.
There would be no such thing as road rage, right?
No
People could just turn and walk away.
You can
Instead,
shout me in my face, I still walk away.
yeah.
You know, it's been many years since I was in Israel, but I remember what a secular country that it was, because I knew about the Sabbath. I hadn't really been converted yet. I was in my 20s. And I watched them keep the Sabbath, and it really was a day to sit back, you know, kind of eat grapes, you know. The men especially would have philosophical conversations and political conversations. And I was kind of amazed, because here I thought I was going to go to Israel, you know. And I think the deception that Israel is still the chosen nation has caused, you know, a lot of this conflict, because I think a lot of Christians are deceived on that point and don't understand the spiritual Israel concept, you know, that the evidence teach, which is such a blessing to understand that.
That's a real important point, is we are spiritual Israel, right? Hopefully everyone here agrees with that. That concept is being lost, and that's to the detriment not just of Christians who are missing out on the blessing of stepping into being spiritual Israel, but it's a detriment to the world, because then you get really bad theology and people saying, well, it's Israel, they can do no wrong. Well, first of all, even when it was Israel before can't do anything, we can't criticize because they're God's people.
I think on that statement, and I'm not getting political, but I do want to say, I don't think people are saying they can't do wrong, but they're defending themselves. It's like if someone came to my house and wanted to hurt me,
Right.
and I honestly had a sister that told me this, I'll never forget this. She said, if someone raped me, I wouldn't fight back. I'm like, what? Wait, I'm sorry, it's not Christian, fight back. And I said, you're telling me that if someone raped you, you would not fight back. This is true. It's literally true. I was like, okay, well, how do you respond to that? Because I'm like, oh, yeah, I would, and I'm running real fast. But with that being said, if someone comes in and we're going to see more wars. We are.
Right.
But you have a right to defend yourself. And I know some people go, well, as a Christian, you shouldn't. But when that person's coming in your house with a sword, nowadays guns, you do have a right to defend yourself. You know what I mean? And that's what's going on here. It's not political, as far as I'm concerned. People invaded another country, they're fighting back. And then they start the propaganda. What's this phrase? From sea to sea. They want, it's not, they have a right to defend themselves like we do.
So, from sea to sea is,
I never heard that phrase before.
well, it's been around since the 40s, and it was basically the Palestinians saying Israel as a founded political nation shouldn't exist. Most people, and Islamic ones then take that to an extreme. Younger people hear that phrase and they don't understand the context, so they're using it, but they don't understand the context of it. But let me ask you something though, and we have a few minutes. So let's not talk about Israel and Gaza. Let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. Russia invaded and took Crimea. And then now they're taking that. So I don't know how many people know this. Ukraine used to be the most nuclearized country in the world. And they gave up their nuclear arms on the promise that we would protect them from Russia. But suppose they had some of those hidden. Do they have now the right to destroy Russia because Russia invaded them?
Russia won't stop until they get their country.
I believe you, but
Russia won't stop because they honestly think that's their country.
I
Years ago, that was Russia. And in there.
but before that, it was actually Ukraine.
Yeah, but before.
The Ashkenazi Jews actually started in that area.
Yeah, but Russia doesn't see that way. He wants that country.
I agree.
He won't stop.
And I agree with you.
And that.
He's not going to stop them.
They are, if I'm not mistaken, they also have a lot of wealth in Ukraine. They had 40% of the wheat.
Right.
They had a lot of, and I think that might be the motivation behind it. But what you have is you have two greedy people, and you have one that invaded.
Right.
So there's no win in that situation.
Right.
But what's happening is that people like me and you, our house is blowing up, and we have no place to live. We were Ukrainians.
Right.
So what do? Do you submit or do you fight?
Right.
And that's a personal choice.
They asked to join NATO, and I think if they had to stir that up, I think things would have been different. But that meant a lot to Russia.
Yeah.
That scared Russia.
Yeah.
Possibly, but they asked to join NATO because Russia had invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, Crimea, it's a no-win thing.
So, yeah, you can point me to who started. So,
Okay.
but part of it is as Christians.
Well, I don't want to this is church, I agree with the lady. Fully. And Israel is supposed to be, a Christian place where you can go and praise God, I have no problem with nothing. And then you got Russia, but you're not really supposed to be political.
Yeah. It's like Bowie said at the beginning of her statement, so we know until Jesus comes what's going to happen.
Jesus is gonna get it.
There'll be wars and rumors of war, right? But, and again, not to be political, but we have to be realistic. Our faith and our understanding of God and who He is should inform our politics, not the other way around. And too often, our politics, if you watch people being interviewed, well, they come down on a side, left or right, whatever, and then they want to do things politically based on that. One of the things, for example, the battle of church and state, right? The Adventist church has a very strong understanding of the separation of church and state. We have a whole part of the conference dedicated to religious liberty. A lot of Protestants, and I use that word loosely because, you know, when they do polls, and it's like 80% of Americans say, well, I'm a Christian. Okay, how many of you have gone to church this year? 20%. How many of you go regularly? 15%. And then when you start asking them knowledge-based questions, so they're arguing, well, we need to have the Bible in schools for kids to read. Have you read the Old Testament? Do you want me to read reading some of those stories? Without the context of you as a parent explaining God's bigger purpose and story? Do you want a secular teacher reading the stories about David and Bathsheba and killing her husband? So, we need, as Christians, I know this is difficult when I hear a pin drop here, but...
Well, we don't want to get in depth in that, so that's why I'm not saying, but I think I can only speak for myself. When I was in school, just the other day, we didn't have either side. It was teaching me learning skills.
Right.
And that's what I want to see back, because it's like, okay, everybody has different learning styles and learning levels. And that's what I'm seeing they're getting away from. And I think that's what people are saying. You're teaching one side now, and there's a lot like the gay flag is in the schools and all that, drag queens and all this, and it's like, where is the education? This next generation is not going to know the learning skills. So I think there's a lot more than that, okay? Because I just think there's a broader picture, because school is for education, and that's what I'm seeing a lot of people getting upset with.
Right.
Because you're teaching your personal views to my children, which I don't really care what your Christian views are, but I want my kids to learn math, reading, education. That's what I send them for.
Right. Well, see what that goes to, though, and it's what happens in politics and things don't, is we want, human nature, we want a simple, clean answer for a very complex, nuanced problem. So they say, well, the problem is we need to have kids reading the Bible in school. Is that really going to resolve it? There's, you know, his mind escapes me now. There's a gentleman that's written numerous books, scholarly books on the Old Testament. He's got documentaries that have been on PBS and all, and I forget him. But he started as a Christian. He went through Harvard Divinity School and all. He knows the Bible back and forth and left upside down. He could argue with any one of us, Pastor, Ron Dupree, anybody, and make them look like they're simpletons. The guy's a genius. So he knows the Bible, but he's also just way off on a lot of things because he's not converted. So it's all that knowledge, but it means nothing.
And
know that it comes down to it. If you don't have Jesus in your heart, that knowledge isn't going to do you any good.
Yeah.
Right.
I just got one thing to say, and it's happening now, and I've been waiting for it. I have some scholars in the Bibles, and it's happening today. All the church, we need to keep out of church, keep the kids learning on the Bible. It's not going to do a whole lot, because they're trying to convert them now. And like you were saying about the gay people and all that, you know what? The bottom line is, right is wrong and wrong is right now. If you go back, anybody look at that today, it's coming and it's coming quick. I've been more right and more times than I walked away with tears in my eyes, because they said I was wrong, but I was right.
Right. So we need to wrap up here, but, so, the point that we were trying to get to here is Israel was supposed to be a light in the world. They were supposed to be reflecting God's character, right? Being compassionate, being caring. There weren't, if they followed through all the laws, there wouldn't have been billion errors, because every 7 years, that extreme wealth would have been redistributed back to where some of it came from, things like that. And now we're spiritual Israel. So the question that we have to ask ourselves as we leave today is, are we, the Kingman Seventh-day Adventist Church, am I, Vicor Powel, are you, Stan, are you a light, are each one, are we a light into the world?
I tried to be.
Are people drawn to us and saying, that person, I like their God, not just, you remember Gandhi's quote, I like Christ, but I don't like his people so much. Hopefully, the whole point of studying this is, hopefully they say to us, I like Bowie and I like her God, because Bowie reflects her God. Right? So that's what we're going to end on is, please, don't be that person that drives someone away from God, or that says Christians are whatever. Be the person that says, that when people say, I want to be like him, or I want to have what he has. Right? That's the whole, otherwise it's pointless, like you said. You can have all the knowledge, we can study day and night. If we're not a light into the world, we're useless. Okay? Anyone have one quick remark, or should we pray?
Yeah, I just like the church, I come to this church. I like y'all's church. You explain things right, everybody's got their little peace of mind, and it's not somebody shoving everything down your throat, you know what I mean? And, it was pretty rude the other night. I have a pastor, he's got the Holy Ghost, and he don't talk nothing but the Holy Ghost. There was a concert outside, there was 15 people, they were locked out. What if somebody got shot? Because they didn't have the doors open. They said, we're running a business here. To the pastor, what do you mean you run a business at the church? Oh, I can't go back.
I am very proud of this church. We are a light on the hill. We're literally on